National Women's Suffrage Association, coordinated by Susan B. Anthony and others of upstate New York. So Amanda Way was one of the people who was part of this movement. She was an abolitionist. She was part of a settlement of African-American freed people who were in Randolph County. And she was one of those people who has left behind records of this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association. What did they say they wanted? Like I've said, they wanted women to have opportunities in the professions, and women to be paid for their work once they went to college. This is a moment where there are a number of middle-class women who are getting education, but professional associations like the bar association and medical associations, American Medical Association, don't want women to be working in those fields, and feminists at the time are pushing for that type of access. So this story of women's suffrage, in terms of the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association, goes like this. These women were petitioning the state legislature. They were trying to get women to have certain, especially property ownership rights. And Helen Guger is a notable person. She's from Tippecanoe County. She's well educated, and I think she has a role as a superintendent in West Lafayette. And she organizes this petition as part of this national movement with Susan B. Anthony to say that women already have the right to vote under the 14th Amendment of the United States. That is, as white women who are born or naturalized in the United States, they qualify as all persons. So if the 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, and et cetera, then women are qualified under the 14th Amendment to vote. And so she, like Susan B. Anthony and many other women, very dramatically go to vote and try to test the rules. Well, let's see if we're going to get put in jail. Why don't we just go and try to vote? Because she argues that women are already covered. However, this in the United States, all over the place, doesn't really get very far. Women do not get the state does not recognize her right to vote. She's told, go home. This is not under the state of Indiana. You do not have the right to vote. This 14th Amendment does not apply to white women. This is very famously litigated in New York when Susan B. Anthony does this, but Helen Guger is part of this national movement. And so women in Indiana and across the country start petitioning their state legislatures for particular protections in their state constitutions for women to have the right to vote. And it's interesting to note that there are many places in North America where women have the right to vote, say by 1917. And so this is the long version of how upper-class white women are getting the right to vote. As of, say, 1917, women are, so this is white is full suffrage. So women have full suffrage at the state level in all of these Western states, and also in all these Western provinces of Canada, which is really interesting. And here, the dotted places are presidential suffrage. So there's some places where under state laws, women have the right to vote for president. They might have the right to vote in municipal elections, because there was this idea that women were sort of guards of the home, and therefore they have the right to represent the home within pocketbook issues related to school boards and other local concerns, but that they should not actually be involved in politics, as the argument went, because politics was a man's business because it was full of lies, and women should remain virtuous and stay out of this debate where everyone is lying to each other. So that's how the argument went. And in many of these places, which are Black, where women did not have the right to vote. And so in the state of Indiana, Helen Guger and the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association were trying to convince the state legislature to grant women the right to vote because these other places did, and making the argument, look, women are already running schools. They're already serving as principals and superintendents. They're already educating the future of our state. Why shouldn't women have the right to vote as well? And they're also pushing, as I've said, for women to get included into bar associations and medical associations. There are actually already women's medical schools that are developing in the late 19th and 20th century. The whole colleges, the medical colleges that are graduating women, and a lot of these female doctors actually have very few options for where they're going to work because it's very hard to get hired. And so a lot of these, women are actually going overseas. And that's sort of irrelevant, but this is part of the goals of these feminists at this time, is to get women into jobs and places of power that men occupy. However, this pressure on the state legislature in the state of Indiana is interestingly a story of failure. If you look at, in particular, at the state of Indiana, women, long story short, women in the state of Indiana are never actually successful in getting the state of Indiana to accept their claims to amend the state constitution to allow women the right to vote. Eventually, what happens is that that is not successful. So let me tell you the story. In the state, in 1917, suffragettes pressured the state, lobbied the state to pass the Maston-McKinley Act in 1917. The Maston-McKinley Act was a vote for partial suffrage. That is, it was a vote. It was a law that the state legislature passed to allow women to have the right to vote in limited ways, especially for local concerns of the state, not necessarily for presidential suffrage. This law, which was passed in 1917 and it was only actually on the books for a short time, was challenged in federal court. And it was challenged by, at least at first, in the case of Bennett v. Jackson, it was challenged by the president of the Indianapolis Stove Company, a major business owner, a major donor to political campaigns. And he said that this was against the Constitution. The state Constitution did not show that women had the right to vote, and therefore you can't pass a law. You have to change the Constitution. And he won. So he won. There was no change. Again, the argument at the time was women need to maintain their virtue and stay out of politics. So that was rescinded. And there were attempts to reframe the way that law was done, and there were attempts to actually create an amendment to the state constitution. And this new lawsuit affirmed White, the previous man, affirmed White in his claim that the state. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words at the end of the day. In this lawsuit, which went before the federal courts, the state affirmed William White, who is the president of the Long Night Lumber Company, another major donor to politics, another major player because he was a really big employer in the state of Indiana. And the state confirmed with him that they had no right to actually have a referendum for the possibility of an amendment to the state constitution, because women should not be able to have the right to vote in any sort of referendum because they don't actually have any right under the Constitution. Therefore, the referendum, if there would be a referendum, the referendum should be only open to men. And that basically killed a lot of this lobbying effort because, as you might expect, a lot of women didn't have the confidence that if they had a referendum, it was only men, that they would win. And so in 1917, at the end of 1917, after these multiple lawsuits to not only challenge a law for partial suffrage, but to challenge the whole concept of a referendum for a new constitutional amendment, I would argue that this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association met with failure. They met with a reality that at the state level, they had very limited power to actually change the Constitution or to make any meaningful change. And they realized that the way that they were going to get the right to vote was by working nationally with other suffrage associations in other states to make a federal amendment, to pass a federal amendment. And so the story of, say, the upper class women, if you want to call them that, the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association in the state of Indiana, you might see as a story of failure, or perhaps it's a story of failure to do anything at the state level itself. Because the only way that they actually succeeded was was through working toward this national effort. However, you might also say that there's another way to tell the story of suffrage in the state of Indiana. And you might say that other way is to go back to the passage of, to the Declaration of Sentiments and the passage of the new Constitution in the state of Indiana in 1851, and to think about the other women in the state of Indiana who were not part of that suffrage association and who might not even have been recognized as worthy feminists by some of those upper class women, and to think about how their stories, the story of working class women in the state, perhaps tells a different story of suffrage in the state of Indiana and in the United States overall. So I want to spend the rest of my time today thinking about how the story of working class women in the state tells a different story of women's suffrage. So I want to go back to the story of working class women, especially first I'm going to talk about African-American women in the state or in the Midwest more broadly. What I have here is a map taken from a book by Annalisa Cox called Bone and Sinew of the Land. And each one of these little circles is a settlement of at least one African-American owned farm which was in the period of the early 19th century, between 1800 and 1860. And Annalisa Cox in her book has done tremendous work to follow the stories of African-American free people who came and settled in the Northwest Territory when this was free land, and oftentimes settled alongside or with the support of Quakers, like Amanda Way actually is one of those people. And who settled for freedom, for the possibility of escaping slavery, sometimes coming from the South, sometimes coming from other parts of the East, but looking for land, looking to homestead and to build a new life in free territory. And it's interesting to know how many dots there are in Indiana, right? How many African-American families settled here in Indiana when this was free territory and this was free land. And the story that I totally recommend getting this book out of the library or buying it. It's such an interesting book. I've never met Annalisa. This is not a personal plug at all. I just have the book. But what's very interesting, she tells the story of Black pioneers who actually settled this sort of foundational infrastructure of the state and dealing with white people coming in later and trying to reimagine the state and reimagine how land and everything worked as of the 1850s and 1860s, in this moment right before the Civil War, and this decade before the Civil War. And that story had a really profound impact on me as I set out to do some of this research, because it helps me think about that passage of the Indiana Constitution in 1851 in a different way. So if this was the story of African-American settlement, or at least if this provides some sort of tiny snapshot into the story of African-American settlement in the early 19th century, let's now think about, what are the population centers, what else is going on around 1850? Well, we have some major population centers, which you see on the map here. These are built around, waterways and this largely agricultural state, especially pig farming, and corn and wheat and other things that can travel along the waterways. There are railroads that are in the process of being built at this time, and there are lots of people who are interested in farming, and this is really good sort of central location as the state of Indiana in terms of selling your stuff to market. And in the 19th century, that was pretty key. You could be a farmer as long as you had a way to get your stuff to market before it disintegrated, before it rotted. And so here, this is a railroad map showing that Indiana was a really great place if you wanted to sell your stuff, because there were a lot of railroad depots where you can sell and move things. It's interesting to know also that in the early 19th century, or mid to late 19th century, because Indiana is such a central location, you might say, for farming, you have multiple communitarian settlements that are established here, like New Harmony, for example, it's Owenite society, people who are reimagining what freedom looks like, what frontier territory looks like, putting together, as I'm sure all of you know this, putting together communitarian societies where they're cooperatively owning land, cooperatively producing something, and therefore sharing those profits. There's a lot of people in Indiana who are sort of reimagining freedom in all different ways. And if you think about that, if you think about the context of Indiana as this free territory, and free sort of means all different things, you think about the Indiana Constitution of 1851 a little bit differently. And you think about it makes you think that the 1851 Constitution is a deeply conservative document, bringing about a certain kind of support for a different kind of state than this sort of open territory of pioneers. So let's look at this new constitution. I mean, we might even think about why is there a second constitution in 1851? Well, now there are more white people with more plans for developing the state, for bringing more industry, for bringing more population, and this is the eve of the Civil War, when there's a lot of discussion about what is the future of freedom or slavery. This is the moment where people are discussing, can someone with slaves move into Indiana or move into the North and keep those slaves? So this is what's happening nationally. And in the state of Indiana, we revised the Constitution to make certain decisions, which are significant to think about. Section 1, we declare that all men are created equal, blah, 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 just like, not to be irreverent, but all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, just like the US Constitution. And it states all people have at all times a right to alter and reform their government, echoing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. However, if you read on, you recognize that there are other deliberate changes that lawmakers are making at this Constitutional Convention, which are significant. One big measure is they declare in 1851 that every white male citizen of the United States, and of the age 21 years and upwards, and every white male of foreign birth, and with a certain amount of residency requirement, who has declared his intention to be a citizen, should have the right to vote. So as of 1851, only white men have the right to vote. And if you read Annalisa Cox's book, you have this deep context about how this is part of an effort to eliminate African-American land ownership and to get African-Americans to leave the state or to become workers for white people, and to reimagine Indiana not quite as free as you might say it was previously. Furthermore, no Negro or mulatto, this is the particular language that they're using in the state constitution, no person of color shall have the right of suffrage. Now, previously, there were African Americans who were voting. And as I've talked with other historians who are actually specialists in Indiana, and I'll tell you more later about how I got to this project, but I didn't start as a specialist in Indiana. They would say, well, wait, there were African Americans who were voting before and even perhaps after 1851. And I want to mention that we don't know actually how well this was enforced. But it's important to note that according to the Constitution in 1851, going forward, African Americans lost the right to vote, even though so many African Americans actually settled the state as pioneers in the early 19th century. Furthermore, it goes into greater detail in the words of the Constitution to tell us perhaps a story here. No Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution. No selling property to this is my language, no selling property to African Americans. There's a whole section here about how a white person gets in trouble if they're trying to sell property to African Americans. And we talk, as U.S. historians, we talk about restrictive covenants as a thing that's happening after the Second World War. It's important to recognize that in 1851, the state of Indiana basically has a restrictive covenant on all property. No contracts can be made where you're selling property to where white people are selling property to African Americans. Lots of African Americans already have property, and this is this legal provision is clearly, if you ask, if you read the history, going alongside a lot of extra legal violence to try to drive African Americans out, to try to take their property, and to try to find ways to seize property of African Americans and businesses as well. The whole livelihoods of African Americans. Fines could be collected by the state for not following these rules, and that money was set aside for the colonization of African Americans. In other words, sending African Americans away. And if you don't know the story of colonization, this is sort of interesting and complicated. There were African Americans who were in favor of colonization, but also a lot of white people. And for a lot of white people, unfortunately, it seemed like the solution among a sizable contingent of white people to send African Americans back to Africa as a solution. So it's interesting to think that the story of, if you think about this Indiana state constitution as such a profoundly, you might say, reactionary document, a profoundly white supremacist document that is empowering white people to take property away from Black people and to not even recognize the property that African Americans have, then you have to rethink the whole story of the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association. You almost have to wonder, why are they so interested in getting white women into the professions and getting white women the opportunities to be paid equally and to vote, when this whole section of their state are African American women don't even have basic civil rights and are losing their whole livelihoods, as well as that of their families, that of the men that they know and are related to. And if we have that as a starting point, we actually have to sort of tell a different story of access to rights, civil rights, and voting rights from the perspective of African American women, and also from the perspective of working class white women, especially immigrants, who didn't have, whose spouses didn't have property rights, didn't have property, and therefore who also didn't have the right to vote and were not associated with people who could vote, and therefore who were also really deeply disempowered in the state if voting rights were the only thing that really mattered. So I want to think about that with you, about the story of rights, of voting rights in the state of Indiana, as a story of women's suffrage, and that story of voting rights for African Americans, and also just for working class people more broadly. That pressure to increase voting rights for the poor is in many ways the story of women's suffrage for a large fraction of people in Indiana who were not people of privilege. So here I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got into this project, but only very briefly, and we can talk more about it later. I am a scholar of socialism in the United States. And I have been interested, I got into this project because I'm interested in the fact that in the state of Indiana, there are a lot of socialists in the late 19th and early 20th century. I know everyone's heard of Eugene Debs, but it's interesting to note that before Debs, sort of Indiana made Debs as much as Debs made Indiana. Before Debs, the Coming Nation, one of the largest newspapers to discuss ideas of social democracy, was located in Greensburg, Indiana. And New Harmony, a lot of these settlements which thought deeply about the visions of social democracy were in Indiana. Indiana was sort of the grand central for discussing or imagining what a social democracy could look like in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I think that's really interesting. This is taking place in Indiana. When the Social Democratic Party is founded, which is later going to become the Socialist Party of America, it's founded in Indiana in 1894. And this party sees themselves as a party that's advocating the voting rights of all working class people. They are in favor of registering to vote all sort of working class people. They're actually in favor and supportive of African American voting rights, in a moment when that is a very controversial statement in many circles. But the Social Democratic Party and the Socialist Party, which it becomes, it changes names in 1901, is in favor of universal suffrage in a much more rich way, honestly, than the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association, because they're talking about suffrage for people who don't have property at all. They're also interested in all these other ways to sort of reimagine a democracy. So as I mentioned before, they want to build small cooperative settlements. In 1894, this is their vision of how to build a social democracy, is to build these communities where everyone is sharing resources, and to support the people who can't fully work for themselves by various types of cooperatives, cooperative food, cooperative production of various types. They're interested in supporting the rights of people to unionize everywhere, and for workers to have real bargaining power with employers. And this is Indiana, which is leading the rest of the country in a lot of these discussions. In 1901, as they turn into the Socialist Party, this argument that working people of all types have the right to vote, should have the right to vote, and should have the right to impact their legislatures and pass legislation, is their biggest argument. Socialist Party is all for universal suffrage, and it's interesting to note that they are ahead of many other groups in the state in supporting women in leading the efforts for women's suffrage. So it's not just a bunch of men who say we really believe in women's rights, sort of theoretically, but they appoint a whole sort of bureau within the Socialist Party nationally, and actually then within each state, of women whose jobs it is to go out and stump for women's suffrage. And they're socialists who are stumping for women's suffrage. So they're also actually not just talking about women's suffrage, but a lot of these women who I've studied, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a few minutes, are talking about changing the culture. One thing that's really important to socialists is that they invite both men and women, because they want to get men used to learning from women. And I think that's really interesting. And another element is that they're really pushing for discussing issues that are important to working class women. So not just, possibilities of education, but they want women to be in the trades, and they want women to be paid equally to men in the trades. And they're interested in working women in various different ways. So the Socialist Party is early, so I can't remember the exact date, but it's something around like 1905. They're appointing women nationally to manage sort of women's issues for socialism. And by 1912, they have a state level women's suffrage association, which I think is a women's bureau. I think they call it the Women's Bureau of the Socialist Party. And they're trying to sort of reimagine gender, which is very interesting to me. So I threw in this slide here just to say this is a big deal. That what the Socialist Party is trying to do in the state of Indiana is shift, away from the two-party system. And as I've talked about this and thought about this, it's important to say what is the two-party system at the time that they're trying to upset? Why don't they just work with one of these political parties? Why don't these working class women work within one of these political parties? Because we now know, with the benefit of retrospect, third parties are a really hard sell in America for a lot of reasons. But let's think very briefly about who are the major parties at the time. Well, we have Charles Fairbanks, who's a Republican. He's a railroad financier, and he is an Indiana senator. He literally runs the railroad, and he's totally against even any rights to strike. I'll talk about the KKK later. He is the representative of he's the main senator. And while there are a bunch of people in the state of Indiana who are really for Debs, they're running up against senators who literally own the railroads and who are totally against any striking. So I want us to recognize that they're working sort of a really uphill battle in terms of gaining party membership in the state of Indiana. But the Social Democratic Party, which becomes the Socialist Party, is really interested in universal suffrage. In 1901, when they change their name and try to build more people in their party, they have two African Americans from the state of Indiana who are at the Socialist Party convention. And I think that's really significant. I mean, I wish it was more, or, it's interesting to know why only two. And that's a fair question. But I found two African American delegates who were accepted as delegates who actually spoke from the floor in this founding convention for the Socialist Party. And interestingly, these two people are both from this home state. One is a barber and the other one is a minister. And I think this is interesting. Again, the Socialist Party says they're in favor of universal suffrage, and this is the way they think they're going to build socialist power. So I want to suggest here, maybe I'm going too slowly, maybe not, but I want to suggest here that the story of suffrage in the state of Indiana is a story of the story that succeeded for suffrage in the state of Indiana is the story of working class people building coalition with one another across the color line and putting pressure on the state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Because these upper class women on their own were not successful in putting pressure on the state to pass the women's suffrage. But when there was a large, massive movement of working class women who were white, working class women who were black, working class men who were African American, when a larger fraction of Americans of various class and racial backgrounds came together in 1919 and together put pressure on the state to ratify that constitutional amendment, they were successful. So I might suggest that the story of women's suffrage in the state of Indiana, the only successful story that we have to tell is the story of this broad coalition building among all of these different parties. And I want to also suggest that this was a really hard sell, that this only really succeeded because of the real grassroots work of a lot of these socialists and other sort of small working class organizations that were trying to support their own people. So for an example, to sort of emphasize what a hard sell this was in the early 20th century, and what a racist state Indiana was, to be quite honest. I want to show you just a few examples. 1903 Terre Haute newspaper. Question: has Negro suffrage failed? And this author of this newspaper article, which I selected as one example, says African Americans are voting in the South and it's a failure. They really shouldn't have the right to vote, and suggests maybe we should be repealing the 14th and 15th Amendment because African Americans are not fit to be citizens. This is not I looked for sort of responses to this article in future newspaper prints, but I couldn't find anything. This doesn't seem like it's an unusual printing. And I think this is important to note how many white people in the state of Indiana were really not supportive of African American suffrage at all in 1903. Remember, according to the state constitution, the African Americans don't have the right to vote. But here they're saying that they don't even think African Americans in other states should have the right to vote. And this is important. I should say, in the state of Indiana, there were African Americans who were voting after the 14th and 15th Amendment. However, so technically, all of those pieces of the Constitution were stricken after the 14th Amendment, and therefore there were African Americans who were voting. That is true. However, what I'm trying to say is a lot of white people are really not in favor of that change. There were a lot of people who are Democrats, and the Democratic Party nationally is a party of white Hoosiers who are not in favor of African American voting anywhere. And this is significant. These are the same people who are against women's voting. So when we note that in 1920, Indiana ratifies this 19th Amendment, it's because a lot has changed in this next 20 years. Another example, Indianapolis Recorder, which is a major African American newspaper, in 1904, prints an article basically about these racist white people. And it's called Always Antagonistic to Negroes, the Position of and Difference Between Northern and Southern Democrats and the Negro Question. And the author of the article reflects on how many people in the North as well as South are weary of Negro suffrage. This is a direct quote. They are convinced that it was a mistake, that it is injurious to this country. Certainly there are very few who believe that Negro domination ought to be forced on any state. this is an African American reflecting on how many white people are really against Black voting overall. And in 1904, there are lynchings all over the place. The KKK has a lot of power. The KKK is actually going to have even more power as of the 1920s, because the KKK has a very long and powerful history in the state. But it's significant to note how many people are against universal suffrage as of 1904. And therefore what a hard sell it is. And I want to emphasize, this Indiana Women's Suffrage Association is not talking about this, or at least not talking much about this reality of Black male disfranchisement. They're only emphasizing white women's opportunities, and that's important. I looked for evidence in the state of Indiana of folks trying to repeal Black voting rights, because again, technically, as of the 14th, 15th Amendment, African Americans have the right to vote in Indiana as of right after the Civil War, 1868. I did not find any discussions in particular about repealing those amendments. But what I did find was a lot of stuff like this, and I'll share. This is in the Journal of the State Assembly in Indiana, which is basically a record of what the State Assembly talks about in their session. Foremost among these, I place, among all the issues they want to talk about, foremost among these issues, basically, I place the preservation of elective franchise from pollution. I believe that I speak for the vast majority of the people in the state when I say that the time has come for the application of drastic remedial measures to the plague of corruption, which is fastening itself upon our politics to an extent appalling to those who look forward to the ultimate in the sort of progress that has been made among these lines in these recent years. This is really cryptic, right? Like, what are they talking about here? But if you look at what else they're talking about in the newspaper and all these in books that are being published and magazines that are being published, it's clear to me as a historian that what they're talking about is how African Americans are polluting African Americans and other people who are pushing for universal suffrage, in other words, everyone having the right to vote, are going to be polluting the franchise, the rights to vote. And it would be better if we did not extend voting rights to too many people, because that would be corrupting the votership in the state. So therefore, when we think about suffrage in the state and who is trying to work against this cultural push to limit suffrage as opposed to expanding it, I think it's important to note all of the work that's being done by the socialists and other parties, especially women's clubs, African American women's clubs, to press to change the culture, to change the discussions on what should politics look like, to change the discussions on what does a democracy look like. And I want to tell you, I wish I had more time, but I want to tell you a little bit about the Women's Committee, the Women's National Committee, which is, as I've said, part of the Socialist Party. And within the state of Indiana, I can tell you about some of the people who work in the Women's Committee. Well, the Women's Committee has a national magazine that actually has been published since like the early 1900s, but as of 1912 or so, they get bigger. The party basically invests in them even more, and really sort of recognizes that women socialists have a lot of potential to shift discussions on democracy, because there's a lot of discussions on suffrage. That's sort of in the news. A lot of people want to talk about it. You can get people to show up at a socialist meeting to talk about suffrage when you can't necessarily get them to show up for other reasons. And also, it just increases the number of people who are discussing socialism if you include women and women's issues. So in the state of Indiana, they set up a women's bureau for some speakers. And I looked into who are the people who work for this Women's Bureau in Indiana. One is Lilith Martin. She is the chief women's correspondent in the state in 1912. She is in her 20s. She has a husband and kids. And this is something she takes on top of all of these other things. And I've looked into what is she doing, literally. So she sets up these local meetings, especially where there are working women, where there's factory production. And she sets up meetings with these women to talk about what are their issues, to give them stuff to read. However, she invites men to be part of all these meetings. And if you look at number 4 here, I don't know if your screen can even see it, but this is part of the rules for these local committees, Our work is not to form separate organizations for women. The Women's National Committee has never favored separate organization. They should be part of the party. So it's sort of consciousness raising meetings. These are meetings for women, but these are not meetings only for women. Some of the issues that they're prioritizing in 1912 are discussions of women's pensions, like that the government should be paying to support women to support their families if their husbands die at work, or if their husbands die at war, that just like women are often paid after the Civil War if their spouses died. The argument is, why shouldn't women be paid if their husbands die at work? It's not their fault, and these children shouldn't have to go into foundling homes, and these women shouldn't have to go to work when they can't be at work and at home and take care of the children at the same time. There are also other issues of education for women. Like I've said, opportunities for women to get trade education and to be welcomed into the trades. Winnie Brandsetter, who's another member of this Socialist Party organization, is really emphasizing as she puts it, the purpose of this committee is to make intelligent socialist unionists and suffragists. And I want us to emphasize that these meetings as not just about socialism. This is about universal suffrage. This is ultimately what convinces the people of Indiana that universal suffrage is meaningful, when there are a lot of people in Indiana who are really against the prospect of expanding who gets the right to vote. I'm going to sort of condense some things here, and then I want to tie up and ask and get into questions in just a minute. So I'm going to very quickly condense here and say, I think that these women in this Women's Bureau were pretty darn effective in changing the conversation about voting in the state of Indiana. This is one particular example of just sort of a representative example of an article where the article says, does a woman support her husband's employer? And the argument is, and this is by a very well-known writer in this circle, the argument is women who are staying home and taking care of stuff at home when a husband goes to work and a husband is underpaid, those women are actually basically supporting their husband's employer by taking care of everything so that their husband can work outside the home. And they should be mad at their husband's employer, not at their husband, but their husband's employer for underpaying their husband and taking them for granted. And this is a really interesting argument, that we're more familiar with this sort of a 1960s, 1970s argument, but it's an argument that gets women involved in politics. And you might make the argument that that's what the feminist movement really was. It's a movement that is getting new women involved in politics and getting Americans to rethink, what does a democracy look like? And I would say that it's these working class women and the Socialist Party. And I'm sorry, I didn't talk as much about women's clubs, African-American women's clubs, but I would say that it's these women in these grassroots organizations that are changing the conversation on what democracy looks like. And as of 1918, there are a lot of women who are working outside the home, who are working in factories, in metal production, in drugs, of course, Eli Lilly, in various kinds of factories. And the socialist suffragettes are really effective in getting these people politically active. And not all of them, but getting a large number of these people politically active. So to conclude, I want to tell you about Florence Waddles. She's from Elwood, Indiana. She's another also young woman who's very involved in politics. I think she's in her 20s or 30s in this moment. She gets called out and specifically noted by name in this national Susan B. Anthony level, story of women's suffrage in the United States. She's called out by Susan B. Anthony as a woman who was able to convince all of the miners in the state of Indiana to support women's suffrage. She gets their signatures, she gets the miners to officially endorse women's suffrage, and she can come back to the to the National Suffrage Association and say, look, I got all these miners behind us. That is something that neither of the major political parties in the state could do. And I think that, Susan B. Anthony sort of suggests, and I don't want to put too many words in her mouth, but she's sort of suggesting that was really pivotal in getting the state of Indiana to endorse women's suffrage when neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party actually sponsored this provision on its own. So I think this is a really interesting story to suggest that organizing at the grassroots level, it is really sort of the only effective way in this particular case to actually make political change. So thank you so much. I would love to take questions.
All right, we do have a few questions, and I'm sure we'll have some more as we sit. Going back to a little bit earlier in your talk, you showed the map with all the different African-American owned properties in Indiana, Michigan, and around us. Yes. What did the numbers represent? Albertine asked us.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I will go back to this. Oh, there we go. So,
there it is.
So Ohio settlement. So in the total settlements in Ohio, 95, in Indiana, 92. So a settlement is a community of African Americans that's of freed African Americans. So it's not necessarily one homestead, but it might be one. But it's probably at least two community homesteads of African Americans. So it's identified as one particular community.
Okay, well, I think she was also asking about the numbers that are actually attached to the dots.
Yes, I was.
Thank you for asking. So that has to do with the book. I mean, this is her picture. And I think I don't remember exactly, but she tells the story of, this is how she sort of tells their story I think these are the numbers that she's associated them. And then in the book, you can read about the stories of all of these different people. And she's categorized them by these numbers just for the sake of her own storytelling.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Another question came in. Did Chinese men and other non-white naturalized immigrant men have the right to vote in the early 1900s?
No. I mean, Chinese Americans basically are part of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1892 is that, I think it's 1892, is that Chinese Americans do not have, are basically considered never possible to be citizens. Because they're excluded, if there are Chinese Americans in the United States who have been in the United States, they have to have certain sort of documents, and this is where we get our whole history of needing passports and other documentation. But it's increasingly hard after 1892 for Chinese Americans to prove their citizenship because for various reasons. So while there are some Chinese Americans who are born in the United States and who are especially part of churches who are advocating for Chinese American communities, there are also Chinese Americans who are not given the right to vote simply because they came into the United States after 1892 and they're unable to get any documentation saying that they're legally in the United States. So some Chinese Americans are voting, but not all of them. And Chinese Americans still keep coming into the United States, especially through Canada and through Mexico in various different ways, but are identified as almost like perpetually illegal. So some Chinese Americans are voting, but not all. I should mention, I don't know of any particular case in Indiana, but nationally there are many cities which are having votes in the late 1890s about having segregated schools where Chinese people are not allowed to send their kids to public schools. There's just a lot of anti-Asian sentiment at that time.
Bonnie asked, what happened to the provisions in the Constitution, the Indiana Constitution, that we had the right to alter and reform the government, and also that property could not be sold to African Americans?
So this is a matter of how these rules are enforced. After the 14th and 15th Amendment, I mean, technically, you can't say Black people don't have the right to vote in any state because the federal Constitution trumps your state constitution. But this is also a moment where the KKK has a lot of power, and so there's a lot of extra legal violence and efforts to drive African Americans out of the state. And we have evidence of that, of African Americans leaving Indiana and going to other places which are less violent and less opposed to African American rights. So it's technically stricken from the Constitution after these amendments, but I couldn't find evidence of state legislatures really sort of talking about how this is morally wrong. I hope that answers the question.
Bonnie also asked about the book that you mentioned in your talk, Bone and Sinew of the Land by Annalise Cox. I actually wrote her name down because I want to look that book up. I've heard of that book. Is she an Indiana author?
I don't know.
I'm always researching Indiana authors, so I thought maybe that's how I actually came across it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually don't know her at all. I just know the book. I would like to know her and to know where she is. I am sorry for the Amazon link, but I put a link just so you could see the title of the book in the chat.
I'm not sure it's available at the library, but you could definitely obviously look it up. And if it's not, we can also, if it's available, if it's still in print, we can, actually get the book and have it in our collection. Bonnie made a comment and a question. What she has learned about Naomi Anderson, the suffragist we were talking about earlier, born in Michigan City in 1843, is that her parents were free people of color who were never enslaved, and also that her father was middle class and had a house painting business. In 1863, Naomi married an African-American barber from Valparaiso. So were they really just exceptions to being farmers?
No, that's a very common story. There were lots of middle-class African Americans. When I say middle class, I mean African Americans who had some amount of land, who were self-supporting, who were not born into slavery. A large fraction of the African Americans in the state of Indiana by the moment of the Civil War were people who were free for a generation or more, because they were in these settlements, and these freed settlements settled with Quakers from the moment that Indiana was really free territory. So yes, it's most common that African Americans that you'll find in the historical record in the late 19th century were born into freedom, and their parents were free. That's why it's such a significant story to recognize that a lot of these families were driven out of the state or driven out of rural spaces and into cities, into very sort of compact places where they didn't have the right to land. And it's important to recognize that there used to be a much larger, fraction of African Americans in Indiana. Yeah, that's not at all surprising, and it's also really significant to me that there's so many African Americans who are working in industry in Indiana, and therefore, I mean, that's why there are more people who are crossing the color line. This is a moment of segregation in the late 19th century, but in Indiana, there's lots of, I don't want to overemphasize it, overstate the point, but there is significant work across the color line in the state of Indiana because Black and white people are doing similar work in railroads at Pullman, of course, Pullman's not in Indiana, but in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, in the work that Debs does on the American Railway Union, which is much broader than just Chicago. There are lots of Black and white workers who are working together, and they're doing that because in the state of Indiana. They know each other, and it's important to note that the KKK is really working against a lot of those efforts at cross-racial solidarities.
Albertine asked, what part of northern Mexico was being considered to house the Negroes in 1851?
Oh, I can pull that up now on my slide, but I don't even remember. But I don't want to mispronounce it. I don't want to remember it incorrectly.
Just curious, that was it.
Thank you for asking.
Anyone else have any questions while Janine's looking at that particular slide? I want to say here that, did you find it?
Yes, Chihuahua, for a session of Chihuahua and 2 or 3 others of the northern and thinly peopled Mexican states, with a view of directing thither a voluntary and assisted immigration of Southern Blacks. That's a direct quote.
I want to say here, thank you, Janine, so much for being here this evening. I was remiss. I had mentioned them earlier, but I don't think everyone was on the call when I did, that the League of Women Voters of LaPorte County and the Women's Commission are sponsors of tonight's program with the library in conjunction with the grant from the Indiana Humanities. And Bonnie Schaaf was instrumental in preparing that grant and also in tonight's programming and getting us all together here tonight. So I want to thank her in particular. Thank you, Janine, so much. We really appreciate that you were able to give us your time tonight. I hope that we will be able to get you to come here in person sometime in the future, and you can maybe bring the kids and visit the beach when you're here.
I can't wait. Thank you so much. This has been
You're
great.
welcome.
And
Thanks,
email me
everyone.
if you have further questions, that I can help with. I'm totally happy to take emails.
Okay, and if anybody needs to contact Janine, I have her email. I know Bonnie has her email. So, if you can't find her through the university at Indiana University in Bloomington, you can actually contact one of us and we'll be happy to share that with her. If something pops into your mind and says, oh, I bet Janine knows that. Thank you all this evening for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope to see you all again sometime soon. Have a great evening, and we will see you all again.
Thank you.
Good night.